Sometimes even good people can make a mistake. And when it happens, it's one of the most intense and emotional experiences of your life. It could be a DUI, or maybe you were in the wrong place with the wrong people at the wrong time. Or perhaps you just did something stupid at the spur of the moment without even thinking, and now you're in trouble with the law. Well, you need experienced legal help right away so you don't become a victim of the criminal justice system. Even good people can make a mistake, and if you, a friend, or a loved one has been accused of a crime, don't make another mistake by hiring the wrong attorney for the kind of help you need. You need to visit toddjohnslaw.com. That's toddjohnslaw.com, and then call Attorney Todd Johns today. Attorney Todd Johns has decades of experience helping good people like you who have made mistakes or bad decisions and will stand by you every step of the way. toddjohnslaw.com.
All right. Hello. Welcome to That's Enough Out of You. I am your host, Bill Rader, and joining me, as he does each and every week, is my co-host, Sean Kane. Sean, what's going on, buddy?
Billy Raids, how you doing there, pal?
I can't complain. Doing okay. How about you?
Fantastic, buddy. We got a great guest today, returning guest, Dr. Joe McBride, who recently retired from his job as a professor at San Francisco State. This is an important episode, Bill. This is why we pushed this up, even though we just recorded not too long ago, because with everything going on, you know, this is really important. And we're going to discuss one of Joe's 25 books that he has out, Political Truth, the Media, and the Assassination of President Kennedy. And you can get that on our bookshop. But the reason I thought this was important, Bill, is because with everything going on, you have millions of people protesting this ridiculous administration's policies. You know, the stock market is in the tank.
Yep.
You know, he's putting tariffs on penguins. I mean, it's just an absolute disaster across the board. Social Security is threatened. And listen, how did we get to this point, Bill, is the question that we discussed in this episode. And we all feel that, you know, the genesis of it is the assassination of President Kennedy in 1963, and what happened afterwards with the cover-up and in the fake news and the media cover-up and the Warren Commission and the distrust in government. And listen, Bill, the Democrats, to me, they have an opportunity here to seize the moment, because they've always been better than the Republicans domestically, most policies. I mean, they're not the ones attacking Social Security. When Biden was in, I put the numbers up, the stock market was fantastic. In 2 months, Trump destroyed it with these tariffs, unnecessary trade war. But the problem, the Democratic Party moved away from the Kennedy wing of the party after the assassination. We talked about that, how the right wing assassinated. But it was so clear on the Luna conference this week, which Jim D'Eugenio testified, when the Democrats just didn't want to bring up the word conspiracy at all because of the fact that, you know, Trump, you know, weaponized that word, and they didn't even want to admit that there was a right-wing regime change to take out President Kennedy. And they need to start moving, instead of distancing themselves, they need to embrace John Kennedy. I put an article up on our website and our Patreon that they need to admit that there was a right-wing regime change, embrace Kennedy's policies, and stop moving away from, you know, the Kennedy wing, which was anti-war. I mean, Kennedy would not support what's going on there in Gaza. He would not support these proxy wars and all the stuff that was going on. So I think that's where I think the Democrats lost a lot of people, is their move towards the right as far as wars and the move away from anti-war. And of course, you know, the right-wing media gaslighted all this other stuff on them, and they need to really embrace John Kennedy, Bill.
Right. That was a really important topic to discuss with Joe, and he was great as usual. He's one.
As usual. I mean, he's tremendous. You know, we did have a little disagreement there where he talked about where he felt Kennedy was a little slow on civil rights, and I don't feel that way. I know Jim D'Eugenio, Lisa Pease, we're in the minority, but if you really look at it, you know, Kennedy had to go around, and I mentioned this to Joe, around the his own party, because of the conservative wing of the Democratic Party didn't want any part of civil rights. So he had to use the court systems, had to use executive orders, and he understood that they were not going to vote for a bill. And, later on, Johnson did pass that bill, but Bobby Kennedy was a big part of that.
Right.
The reason he stayed on. So all that is important, Bill. And I just think that, the Democrats have a chance to seize the moment here. And they got to get right now, there's no leadership in the party. And they have an opportunity. You've seen protests, millions of people all over the world, all over the country, disgusted with this administration. And I think the Democrats need to go back to the Kennedy wing of the party, Bill.
Well, I hope all of these people show up when it's time to vote.
Well, let's give them a reason.
Yeah.
Let's give them a reason.
All right, Sean. So without further ado, let's get to our conversation with Joe McBride. All right. Joe McBride, welcome back to That's Enough Out of You, one of our favorite guests.
Good to see you guys. Thank you for
Joe.
having me again.
Yeah. Good to have you back.
So, Joe, tonight I want to talk about your book, Political Truth, the media, the assassination of President Kennedy, and really, get into how the Kennedy assassination and the media lies led to, Trump, January 6th, the rise of fascism, and really this hell that we're living in today. So I want to get into all of that, but let's talk about your book, Joe. What made you write that book?
Well, I wrote the book Into the Nightmare, which came out in 2013, which is the result of my 30 years of serious research into the Kennedy murder and the Tippit murder as well. I wrote about 400 pages in the Tippit case, which hadn't been really covered properly before. But I was a volunteer on JFK's 1960 Wisconsin presidential primary campaign when I was 12, and that's a picture there in the background I took of him speaking 2 blocks from our house, Wauwatosa City Hall. It's a suburb of Milwaukee, and he held a rally called Kids for Kennedy, and I got to meet him. There were only about 100 people there, and very casual. And then I met him again at the big Milwaukee rally, the climax of the campaign that's in the film Primary, which is a classic film I recommend. And I met him briefly when he was president. So I was very dedicated to him, and I, under his inspiration, I wanted to become a lawyer and go into politics. And then when he was killed, it upended my entire world, and I lost a lot of faith in our system and decided to become a writer instead, and set me on my path. And I've spent my life writing mostly books about films, film biographies and film critical studies, and I've been a teacher. I just retired after 22 years at San Francisco State teaching film. But my real mission, I think, has been the Kennedy assassination all these years. And when I did Into the Nightmare, which took about 7 years to write, I kept thinking I wanted to do a chapter on how the media have lied systematically about his murder ever since. And it's such a big subject, I could never quite figure out how to do it as a chapter. I had one chapter in the book, which is media criticism, which I do in film writing. I critique the coverage of the weekend of the assassination, which I call a 4-day docudrama. First of all, you have the big shock on the Friday of the murder, and then the suspect being arrested and paraded before the cameras. And then you had, he was tried and convicted basically on TV over Friday and Saturday. And then he's murdered on Sunday, which is the climax on live TV. And on Monday, there's the satisfying, epilogue where they had the grand military funeral. And so it's, by the end of the 4 days, the public was supposed to have kind of had a catharsis and gotten over it. And to me, one of the most disturbing comments ever made about the assassination was made by Dan Rather in one of the many specials he did looking back on it. He said, people talk about, the 4 days of that weekend. And he said, it's the 5th day that I think about, Tuesday, the 26th, when America went back to work. He said, millions of Americans went back to work, and the country stayed on course. And he found that very satisfying. And the media basically kind of sold that message that everything was okay. You know, we'd had this unfortunate event, but now it's over and let's move on. And Johnson gave his speech on the 28th where he said, let us continue. And he pretended that he was following Kennedy's policies, but we didn't, there was so much we weren't being told at the time, including that he had reversed Kennedy's Vietnam withdrawal plans secretly on the Sunday, the 24th, and committed ourselves to a big war in Vietnam. And so I remember the 26th very vividly. I went back to school in Milwaukee, and I felt empty and shattered. You know, I didn't know what the future would bring. And, you know, and that was also the day I saw frames from the Zapruder film in Life magazine. I went down to a magazine store after school in downtown Milwaukee, and they had big stacks of Life magazine lined up against the wall, and I bought the issue, and they had those black and white frames where you got to see the sequence of events, but they left out some of the key details, you know, the headshot, etc. And but you know, the whole thing was such a trauma for all of us, and changed my life completely. And so I wanted to, you know, after Into the Nightmare, which keeps selling steadily, I'm very glad people around the world keep buying the book. And but even though I wrote this critique of the 4-day docudrama, I had so much more to say. And so I spent a couple of years writing a complete book on how the media lie about it, the mainstream media, and but the alternative media, such as you guys, you know, podcasts are a great medium, which we didn't have back then, but it's an alternative way of getting the news out and having serious discussions. And then also books have more freedom than newspapers in America. You know, if you're on a newspaper and you start questioning the Kennedy assassination, you lose your access and you lose your job pretty quickly. But you can write books about it, and it's easier to get them published than anything else. And people make movies about it. So the alternative media have kept it alive. And the American public generally has had 60 or 70% of people doubting the official story from the beginning. With a brief blip after the Warren report came out, people started, you know, believing the official story for a while. But then serious books started coming out in 1966, about a whole spate of them that made people reconsider the case. And that's what happened with me. That the very first day, I didn't believe the official story, and I could explain why. But I had a bit of a relapse after reading the Warren report, and then I kind of got back into it. And so I've been studying it since it happened. I actually wrote a short story about it in October 1961, before it happened, about the Kennedy assassination. When I was a freshman in high school, I wrote a short story called The Plot Against a Country, because since I had met Kennedy at close range, he seemed to have little or no security, and I was concerned about his safety. I was already, you know, a history buff, and I was a student of the Lincoln assassination, and I was, you know, so I wrote this kind of juvenile short story imagining his assassination 2 years before it happened.
Wow.
Wow.
So Joe, talk about, you know, in your book, you talk about, you know, how these official stories, you know, the Kennedy assassination and all the other assassinations in the 60s and Watergate and Vietnam and Iran-Contra and even the 2000 election and everything, the official story ends up not being the correct story. And it leads to Trump being able to say everything is fake news, because in the past there was situations like this that they use fake news. So talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, that became the theme of my book, you know, because I had waited a while to write it, and by then Trump was had come and gone as president, and I was writing it as the January 6th events were taking place, so that became an important part of the book. But I really realized most people think the loss of credibility of our government began with Vietnam, but I think it began with the Kennedy assassination. And
I agree.
I
Yep.
remember as a kid, we automatically kind of believed, at least I did as a naive kid, believed what the president said and the government said. And, I mean, there were adults who were more sophisticated, but when Eisenhower lied about the U-2 plane in 1960, that was a big shock that the president had been caught in a very important lie, and we were kind of stunned. And the irony today, I say, is that if the president tells the truth, it's shocking. You know, we've gone
Right.
180 degrees in the opposite direction. Lying has become expected, and George W. Bush was kind of pioneered the brazen lying, where he basically didn't care if people realized he was lying. His attitude was, "What are you going to do about it?" You know, and he also broke the law with impunity and got away with a lot of it. And then Obama sent his Attorney General Eric Holder out to announce that the president had the right to kill American citizens at will. He had killed a couple of American citizens with drones. He killed about 10,000 people with drones, which is supposed to be illegal. It's a form of assassination. But he killed a couple of American citizens, and Holder said he could do that if he wanted. And that was one of the low points of American democracy. Another one was when the Bush people announced that we were torturing people. They actually announced it, and they got away with it to some extent, although there was the inevitable backlash, which I think will happen with Trump eventually. But how much damage will be done before it happens? But to get back to your theme, when I wrote Political Truth, I realized that the Kennedy assassination had really shattered this credibility that the government had, because the public instinctively and intelligently realized that couldn't have been the work of one lone gunman with no apparent motive, you know, and there were too many things that didn't add up. And the government lied about it. They didn't want to solve the crime. That was a huge shock to me, that the government didn't care about solving the crime. And then Vietnam comes to the foreground at 64, 65. And there was what was called the credibility gap. We remember people didn't believe Johnson because he was lying about the war a lot. And he didn't raise taxes to pay for the war until you know, sometime after he was accelerating, and that really hurt the economy. But that was because he didn't want to get up and say, "Yeah, we're fighting a big war in Vietnam, and this is why." And you know, if you're having a war, you need to rally the public behind you, like in World War II, to get support. And if you're doing a war without public support, it's a recipe for disaster, and that's what happened. And then came Watergate, which made it clear to everybody that conspiracies do exist, contrary to what the New York Times and the Washington Post keep telling you. And then the church committee had an effect on me and everybody, you know, revealing CIA's assassination plots against foreign leaders, and some were successful. And then Iran-Contra during the Reagan years, and all these things eroded public trust because they were lying and trying to get away with stuff. And then you had the Gulf War, a lot of lies there, and 9/11, the 2000 election. All these things helped contribute to people becoming very cynical. And as Obama said some years ago, one of the biggest problems we have is we have two forms of reality believed by the American public. Half the people believe one set of facts and half believe the other set of facts. And I quote Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who had a very shrewd line. He said, "Everybody's entitled to his own opinion, but everybody's not entitled to his own facts."
Right.
And I told that to students all the time. You know, you can have any opinion you want in our country, but back it up with facts if you want to be credible. If you have an opinion without facts, which a lot of people do, or they bring out phony facts, lies, and we're seeing a lot of that today with this Signal chat story, where it was obviously classified information. You had a parade of administration officials flagrantly lying and saying, "Well, that wasn't classified information," which is so absurd. But you know, no wonder the public doesn't believe in the government. But it's, healthy skepticism is a good thing, because
Sure.
we were too naive in the Eisenhower and Kennedy years. But when you have complete lack of trust,
Right.
and it is very alienating, and it leads to this situation where half the country is believing a charlatan, and it seems it's very hard to get through to them. And although it is having some effect, as you can see, that a lot of the Trump voters seem to be very angry now, and it's caused that problem. And I really think there's a direct connection back to the Kennedy assassination. That's what I write about in Political Truth.
We will be right back. DK's Corner, now located at 201 Cherry Street in Jessup, Pennsylvania, is serving up the area's best tasting food at respectable prices. Known for our great cheesesteaks, DK's also has delicious breakfast sandwiches, specialty coffees, and catering 7 days a week. You'll love the wraps, soups, and pizza too. We're now open Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., and Saturday, 8 a.m. to 3 p.m. Visit DK's Corner on Facebook to see our daily specials, and make sure to follow and like us while you're there. We offer local delivery to homes and businesses, takeout, or come and dine in our new restaurant in Jessup. Call or text DK's Corner at 570-209-0278, or hit us up on DoorDash. And we thank DK's Corner for sponsoring That's Enough Out of You.
Well, talk to me, Joe, about how you think that led to, the January 6th insurrection, and how basically, the fake news that's out there, and people don't believe the official story. And you got so many people, especially hardcore MAGA, that believe that, January 6th was an operation, a psych ops, and, the Trump caused the insurrectionists, he calls them prisoners. You call in all this nonsense that's out there, and they denied the whole thing. And talk to me about that.
Yeah, as I was writing Political Truth, the fallout was continuing from January 6th. I mean, I got up early and watched it on TV because I sensed that something big was going to happen, and sure enough, it was so obviously a coup attempt. But the word coup is one we don't like to use in America, because we like to think we're exceptional, and that happens in other countries. There's certain things we don't use the word strongman in America. We label authoritarian foreign leaders strongmen, but I like to use those words to refer to people like Trump, and I referred to the Bush-Cheney regime. Regime is another word that the media don't like to use, but that's what these people are. And so January 6th, right away, a number of Republicans came out and condemned it, and called it a coup attempt. But what happened in the media, and I trace this because George Orwell mentioned that distorting language is one of the ways that fascism and authoritarianism takes over, is when you start playing around with words. And we see that a lot with the Trump people today. But after January 6th, the media started doing that. They started downgrading this coup attempt to an insurrection, which is bad enough, but then they started calling it a riot, which is kind of something that happens a lot. And then some Republicans started saying ludicrous things, like one guy said it was like a bunch of tourists strolling through the Capitol or something. Some Republicans said that.
Yeah, more than one, Joe. More than one.
Yeah. Well, yeah, they were all falling over each other to go down to Mar-a-Lago and kiss the ring, and it was kind of astonishing to see that people who 2 weeks before had condemned what happened were starting to make excuses for it. And then Trump winds up pardoning these people, and but a lot of them were brought to justice and went to jail, and but there's an attempt to rewrite history in an Orwellian way, and that's part of what happened with the assassination. You still read the New York Times and the Washington Post have been adamant since 1963, and just lying, as Garrison said, black is white and up is down, quoting Alice in Wonderland.
Mhm.
And they want to pretend that this lone nut with no connections and no motive killed Kennedy, and for no reason at all. And that makes it easier for some people to accept. They put out a lot of ways of maligning conspiracy theorists, and that's the word conspiracy. The term was popularized by the CIA in 1967 as a way of shutting down discourse and also stigmatizing people who were dissenters on the assassination. That, for a long time, if you tried to talk about it with your friends, they would get this blank stare or this hostile thing, and they would say, "Oh, you're a conspiracy theorist." And I was supposed to shut down discussion, and they used a lot of personal attacks, calling people crazy. And there was a guy in the New York Times a few years ago wrote a book review and said that conspiracy theorists should be treated like smokers. They should be made to go outside and stand in the rain. If you hear somebody in your office talking about something like that about the assassination. So it made it hard to talk about it. But I and other people just I put up with that kind of bullshit and kept talking about it. I do find, when I taught my students, they don't know much about history, unfortunately, because the Republicans have taken care to dumb down the educational system, which is a serious
Sure.
problem. But when I talk about the assassination, they're very eager to learn. And I would show them parts of JFK. There's a long section of the Stone film where Garrison shows the Zapruder film in court and analyzes it. It's very interesting. It's film analysis within a film.
Mhm.
And then I would show parts of Rush to Judgment, the excellent documentary that Emile D'Antonio and Mark Lane made from Lane's book, and has some great interviews with witnesses and very honest, ordinary people. Those are the real heroes of the case, these ordinary people who came forward at great risk and told the truth. So I dedicate Into the Nightmare to people like S.M. Holland, who was on the railroad overpass and told the truth, what he saw, gunfire coming from the grassy knoll. Aquila Clemens, black lady who was a domestic working half a block from the Tippit shooting and saw two men there and was very honest and talked about it. And then she disappeared. Her life was threatened by a policeman, and she was never seen again after she was interviewed for that film. And what happened to her? And other people like that. Marianne Moorman took that Polaroid shot of Kennedy being shot. And you see the
Yeah.
fence and the retaining wall in the background, and there's apparently a policeman firing from behind the retaining wall. And so a lot of what we know about the case comes from these witnesses, and so it gives you faith in ordinary people that kind of thing happens.
And Joe, you have to wonder what the reaction is going to be. Now we're hearing that they're going to release this tape that NBC has supposedly been sitting on for years, showing Oswald, I guess either near the motorcade or where.
Bill, I think that when Luna was talking about that, I think she got it wrong. I think they are talking about the prayer man figure.
Yeah.
I was talking to Linda Zambini about that.
Okay.
That's what I think. I think she just misspoke because again, this task force isn't really familiar with any of the case.
Right. But
But I think they are
the point
talking
is,
about the prayer man.
they're supposed to be releasing the video that shows him, and clearly it would exonerate him. I mean, obviously a little late for that now, but um,
Well,
there are still people who won't believe it. There are still people who will say that this is a fabrication or whatever. And
yeah, today is the anniversary of Reagan's shooting, and there's a White House photograph taken at the moment of the shooting where you see Reagan in the foreground. In the background, you see the upper part of the hotel, and you see an open window, and there's a hand stretching out the window. There was probably the gunman because Hinckley didn't shoot Reagan. Hinckley's shots hit other people, but Reagan was shot from a bullet that hit the car from a downward angle and ricocheted up into his armpit. And you see a hand jutting out of the window. And Judy Woodruff, who's still around, TV and radio reporter, was there, and she said the shots came from the balcony. And she doesn't say that in her autobiography. You can't say that and get the kind of job she has. But just to say about Luna, it's great that she's having hearings. She's a little wobbly on this film because NBC, she claims it's never been seen, and that seems to be a misnomer if she's talking about the films that she's discussing, because we've seen some of these, but the footage is blurry and shaky because the cameraman jumped out of the motorcade and was running, etc. But if we want to see Oswald, if he's there on the steps, what we're talking about is getting to see the original film that could be analyzed better, that's sharper, and it's a film, not a video too. There were nobody was shooting videotape in Dealey Plaza. I go
Right.
into a lot of detail about the media coverage. One thing that was absurd in 1988, there was Ted Koppel on Nightline said Zapruder was the only person taking film of the assassination. And there were several people who captured parts or all of the shooting. Much more in Nix and other people. There was the Babushka lady film that never showed up, and supposedly CBS had a cameraman in the motorcade who got it all on 16 millimeter. It had the camera trained on Kennedy when he was shot, and then went up to this school book depository window with the camera and came back down. And that film has never been seen. But nobody was shooting videotape. That existed, but it wasn't in common use. She's kind of thinking of what would happen today if that happened. You'd have 100 video cameras going. But there were about 18 to 20 people with movie cameras there, and there were about 20 photographers. But one reason we don't have very good professional coverage of Dealey Plaza is that in those days, there was a flatbed truck that went right ahead of the presidential limousine, and they had pool photographers on the truck taking pictures. And you see, Vince Palomara's research on the Secret Service, you can see that truck preceding Kennedy and other motorcades, but it was supposed to be in the Dallas motorcade. And at the airport, Roger Warner, Secret Service man, took the little cards that had numbers on them that were on the windshields of all the cars and moved them around and reordered the cars, and the truck was left behind at the airport. So you didn't have the professional photographers who would have had, great shots of the motorcade. Oddly enough, Ike Altkins, the AP photographer, through great instinct, positioned himself exactly where the fatal shots occurred. He was standing at the side of the road and got some important shots, although he froze when the fatal shot was fired and didn't get it, but he took one right after it, and he took one before it that has panoramic view, and some people think you see Oswald in the background. That was noticed even at the time, and people have debated ever since, was that Oswald or Billy Lovelady who looked like him?
Yeah.
But that was the best professional coverage of the assassination, but the job mostly fell to the amateurs. Again, I talk about this so much in Political Truth. It's the ordinary people who covered this event, both photographically and in terms of being witnesses. Some of them are still alive, like Bill and Gail Newman, who were really close to the incident, and they've talked through the years. I admire them a lot because they don't change their stories. They're very, very clear about what they have to say, and they don't embellish things. Some of the witnesses have embellished. Like I met Jean Hill, who got a lot of coverage, and I came to realize she didn't have any credibility because she changed her story all the time. And she put out a book. Some people wanted to profit from it, but the people who tell the same story and are consistent, like Marianne Moorman, who was her friend standing next to her, is an honest person and keeps telling the truth, and she's still with us. And so anyway, that's part of I think Luna. It is very important to be precise about terminology, and I hope she is clear about. She said this film that she's seeking, or video she calls it, has never been seen, but you don't want to give people reasons to dispute what you're saying. You want to say, well, what we want is a clear original first generation copy of this film, not video. But at least she's trying, and she's getting people on the record, and she stated that she knows that it was not one man killing the president, and she seems to have endorsed Jefferson Morley, who is now saying it was a small clique in the CIA. I think the one thing I learned in political truth that surprised me to some extent was the plot was much bigger than I realized.
Yeah.
One of the tropes that people use to make fun of conspiracy theories is they use words like a vast conspiracy, and that's supposed to be absurd, but it was a rather large conspiracy. A lot of people were involved. It's an operation that was complicated, and we don't know
Regime
all,
change
all
operation.
what's regime change, and it took a lot of different people to do different tasks. And one of the biggest surprises to me, but it became clear, and nobody else has ever said this, I think Kenny O'Donnell was the inside man at the White House on the plot.
Yeah.
He was the chief of staff for Kennedy. He was the appointments secretary, which is in fact chief of staff. But he was a traitor to Kennedy, and he was all over the place. He was helping pick the motorcade route, which was a fatal decision because it violated Secret Service rules about making that sharp turn that reduced the speed of the car and went right past the school book depository and the grassy knoll. And he was the primary decision maker. And he was the guy who basically was in charge of stealing the coffin from Parkland Hospital when the medical examiner, Earl Rose, who had the statutory authority to do the autopsy and would have done an honest autopsy because he did excellent autopsies on Tippit and Oswald. And if he had done his autopsy, which would have taken 3 or 4 hours, we would have had answers to where the bullets hit and everything. They didn't want that to come out. So they had this almost gunfight in the hall at Parkland. And that was one of my big paradigm changers when I started studying the case after I had my initial doubts. I read Manchester's book in 1967, and he revealed the standoff in the hallway, which took about 10 minutes. And Secret Service men pulled guns. Mrs. Kennedy was standing there, and they were shouting and using obscene language. It was quite extraordinary. And there was a push-pull, over the coffin. And finally, a justice of the peace, Theron Ward, gave the okay to take the coffin to Washington. I say coffin because I actually think the body might not have been in the coffin. I think there was another route that they could have taken it out by. And if they had opened the coffin and found there was nothing in it, that would have exposed the whole conspiracy. But I interviewed Henry Wade, the DA of Dallas County, who was the authority of, he was going to prosecute Oswald, et cetera, and he ran the Ruby trial. But he told me it was his decision to let the coffin go because the JP didn't want to make the decision. He called him, and Wade said, yeah, let it go. He said, it's $100 fine. And he kind of was jocular when he reminisced about this. And he said, yeah, who cares about $100 fine, But he did admit to me, he said, we made a lot of mistakes. I made a lot of mistakes, he said. I just want to say one more thing. 2 of the most important interviews I had were with Wade and Jim Lavelle, the detective who was the lead detective in the Tippit case. He's the tall detective in the white suit who's handcuffed to Oswald when he shot. People remember him. And he gave a lot of interviews. He lived to age 99. He was very open to talking to people. And he lied to some extent, and he was a racist. He made some shocking comments. And, I told him when I heard the Dallas police radio, the policeman seemed almost blasé for half an hour or so talking about the Kennedy being shot. And then I said, once they said an officer was shot, suddenly everybody gets very excited and agitated. And the pace accelerates. I said, how did you feel about the difference between Kennedy and Tippit being shot? And he had this little evil smile, and he said, well, it's like the old saying, Kennedy's being shot, he said, wasn't no different than a South Dallas N-word shooting, is what he said. And
Unbelievable.
Wow, unbelievable. That's how these guys thought, though. Some of the policemen were members of the Ku Klux Klan. I interviewed one of them who showed me his Klan membership card. Morris
Yeah.
Brumley. But Lavelle told me a number of things. He said that when he got to the station and they were talking with Will Fritz, the head of homicide, who was making a lot of decisions, and he knew more than Wade did. He said, Captain Fritz told me, he said, we got to wrap up Oswald on this Tippit shooting because we don't really have a case, don't have much of a case on him for killing Kennedy, which is very extraordinary. And if they had said that on TV at the time, the public would have had a very different view. And I said, well, what was different about the Tippit case that you thought you had? And he said, well, we had witnesses. And that's a problematic statement because the Tippit witnesses are all over the map. That was one of the things that took me years of study to try to figure out, very clashing witnesses. And I can go into that, but they really didn't have witnesses of Oswald shooting Kennedy. Wade claimed they had 5, and I said, well, they didn't come forward. The only one who came forward was Howard Brennan, who at first denied when he saw the lineup that he couldn't identify Oswald. He said he was afraid, and then he said, oh yeah, that was Oswald. But they really didn't have witnesses, and Chief Curry admitted the next day, I think it was, that, we don't have witnesses of Oswald shooting. And the ballistics don't convict Oswald, they exonerate him. John Armstrong has proved with really great research that Oswald didn't own a pistol or a rifle, and the ones that were entered into evidence are plants. And so they when Oswald was hauled before the cameras at midnight, everybody saw this, and he seemed shocked when the reporters said, you're being charged with murdering the president. And he said, nobody told me about this. He said, the first thing I heard about it was when the reporters in the hall asked me that question. And then some reporter in an angry voice said, you have been charged, like he thought he was lying. But Lavelle said, no, he was telling the truth. We hadn't charged him with that crime. We'd only charged him with the murder of Tippit. And they charged him with the murder of Kennedy soon after that press showing. But I found an FBI document that said he was never arraigned for shooting Kennedy, only for shooting Tippit, which is extraordinary, So the Tippit case became really crucial in my view, that it hadn't been studied properly, and I set out to do that.
Joe, I want to go back a little bit. When you were talking before about the Luna Task Force, one of the things that concerns me, and you brought this up, I'm worried about a limited hangout here where they're going to blame a small group of rogue CIA officers. And you said yourself how vast, the conspiracy really was. And I think it's important that, if she really wants to do this right, to get the right people that have been studying that understand this, like yourself, would be great to talk about the Tippit murder, Jim DiEugenio, Lisa Pease, people like that. Bring experts on that have been studying the case for 30, 40 years. And then we could get somewhere. But I'm worried about a limited hangout. I really am, with the stuff that's coming out.
Yeah, they do that all the time in government. That's a great Watergate expression. A modified limited hangout was the term. I love that term. That's part of what they do. One thing they do is if there's some big event, they create a commission to study it, which delays people's indignation, and then the commission puts out some sanitized version of it that won't really shake people up too much. But the modified limited hangout is a tried and true thing. They pick some scapegoat, or they make some, a small clique within the CIA exonerates the bigger organization, and then other groups that were involved, the Defense Department, ONI, Secret Service. What about them? But I think that she seems a bit over her head. I mean, I give her credit for caring about it, but I think she said she was going to call Oliver Stone to the first hearing on April 1st. That's a good start because he's a good spokesman for general theory about the case, and he knows a lot about it.
I heard some news about that. I don't know. I don't know if I could say it, so I'm not going to say it. But what I heard is really good. So if what I heard is true, it's going to be very good news when Oliver testifies. Let's put it that way. From what I heard,
maybe he will say something revealing or something. Huh? Well,
there's more to it, but I haven't been. They told me that I don't know if I could say it yet, so I won't say it. But
we'll find out.
It could lead to something really big, and let's leave it at that. It could be really good.
Well, one story I think the media have missed, I looked at all the documents that were released the last few days, but, I skimmed them to see what they were about. I haven't had time, nobody's had time to really read everything, and I read some, but, some are very long. But, what struck me, a couple of things struck me. There are some important documents that were released.
Oh, yeah.
Yesterday, I talked to a friend of mine who's, just an ordinary spectator of the media and a smart guy, but he thinks, obviously, he went to Dealey Plaza and he said, well, geez, it's obvious to me there was somebody shooting from the area of the railroad bridge and the grassy knoll. And, I mean, it's quite obvious. But he said, it seemed like nothing important was released, right? That's what the media were telling. To me, the New York Times and the Washington Post are the biggest culprits in this whole thing. And the New York Times, the way they covered it was when the moment the papers were released, like 7 minutes later or something, they ran a little story and it said, we haven't had time to look at any of these, but the headline said, Oswald still did it.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, 80,000 pages they look through.
Yeah, and they never look at the documents. This is their history of, over the years, like they say, the 26 volumes don't contain anything that changes the official story. Well, they didn't, it takes a long time to read the 26 volumes. It takes at least a year. They didn't do that. They don't care. But it was actually rather cavalier and insulting. Their headline, Oswald still did it. I mean, that's the level of discourse at our most important paper, and this.
Well, it's also like the Gerald Posner book, Case Closed, and he never read any of the declassified documents, and he admitted that. I mean, it's ridiculous.
Yeah, I mean, the title of the book is insulting, Case Closed.
Yeah.
It's like Dale Meyer's book on Tippit, which I call the Warren Report of the Tippit case. It's titled With Malice, Lee Harvey Oswald and the Murder of Officer Tippit, I think it's called. And so he's got the conclusion in the title, and, they start with the conclusion, they work backwards instead of the other way around. And Thomas Jefferson once said scholars should be willing to revise their theory according to the evidence they find,
Sure.
and not the opposite. And you have to keep that in mind when you're studying, say, the Kennedy case. Is you come in with some theory or some idea, and you might find something that changes things. Anyway, looking at these documents, I'll just say, this is an example of one little thing that I noticed, but it could be important. You have to be a real expert to understand these documents.
Yes.
But
Yes.
some of the most significant ones for history, the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board, which most people don't even know about, is an important secret group that evaluates intelligence. And they release the minutes of these all through the Kennedy administration, which is going to be great fodder for historians. And one of the members I happen to know was General Jimmy Doolittle, the World War II flying ace. I mean, he was a ace flyer who led the 8th Air Force, and he bombed Tokyo, Medal of Honor winner. And I interviewed him because he was a high school classmate of Frank Capra, and he helped me on my Capra book. And very interesting guy. But, I didn't ask him about being on the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board. And he was the guy who did the Doolittle report in 1954, which is very important because it said basically we have these ruthless adversaries, and we have to start acting like them and discard our traditional notions of justice and fair play in a dangerous world. And that kind of helped open the door to a lot of abuses. But D.H. Byrd, the man who owned the Texas School Book Depository, was a right-winger, rich guy who made a fortune from the expansion of the Vietnam War, and he's suspicious for a number of reasons. One is he bought a lot of stock right before the assassination, and it escalated in value when Johnson widened the war. But anyway, he bought this building. Most people don't know that the School Book Depository was a relatively new operation. It was called the Sexton Building for a long time. And on the police radio, some of the officers are saying the Sexton Building. That's what they used to say. It was a food warehouse. And he transformed it into this school book warehouse where all the textbooks for Texas would come in there and get distributed, and he rented space to publishers, et cetera. And some people think it's a Potemkin village. It was kind of set up with the long-range plan of helping stage the assassination. And they had these guys working on the floor of the 6th floor the day of the assassination, which allowed strangers to come into the building, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of suspicious things. But his alibi, where he claimed he was on safari in Africa in the month of November with General Doolittle. And I always thought that was interesting. And then I find out that in the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board, I looked up the ones for November 21st and 22nd, and Doolittle was in Washington. They were all meeting in Washington. They were at the executive office building next door to the White House on the 22nd. Doolittle was at that meeting, and Clark Clifford adjourned the meeting like at 1:35 and said, we have just learned the president was killed. We're going to have to adjourn the meeting out of respect. And so that kind of helps question Byrd's alibi. And then I looked it up. Other people have questioned his alibi, and that's detailed. It's interesting. But what people have missed the story about, there's a lot of anger that they were so eager to release everything just willy-nilly. They didn't redact the social security numbers of people.
Yeah.
Which is a real violation of their privacy. And, we don't want redacted documents, but there are some things that are personal. And,
Sure.
You could do identity theft and steal people's money. And so a lot of people are still alive, like members of the church committee staff and the HSCA staff. There are about 100 civilians on each staff. And a lot of them were young people. And so a lot of them are still around, and they went crazy about this. And so the Trump people said, well, we'll give them new social security numbers, but the point I was going to make is the other story the media have missed is a lot of this stuff doesn't seem to have much to do with the Kennedy assassination that was released. A lot of it is disclosing names of CIA agents and CIA stations, top secret information and contacts in foreign governments, which is very sensitive, and also personnel files of CIA people. It's a massive leak of CIA stuff, and it's helpful for history because one thing that I've noticed was they disclosed certain covert operations that we didn't know about.
Mm-hmm.
And Richard Helms and Angleton and David Adley Phillips' testimony is released that was secret before, and is bound to be allowed in those. But I think Trump kind of did this, whether intentionally or not, to kind of screw the intelligence agencies. He doesn't like the intelligence agencies, and part of that, it's contemptuous to appoint unqualified people like Tulsi Gabbard to be the head of national intelligence, and she's probably a Russian plant on top of that. But they're exposing all kinds of secrets that the CIA has been protecting, and some of them shouldn't have been secret, but now we know. It adds a lot to the historical record about Cuba. There's an awful lot about Cuba, and there's stuff about Russia, and there's a lot about Mexico City, because Oswald allegedly went to Mexico City before the assassination. I don't think he actually did, but there's a lot more information on those subjects that will help researchers. But I do think he did this partly to embarrass the CIA. There's not a lot released yet from the FBI. They claimed recently they found 2,400 documents, but they haven't turned up in these data dumps, but maybe they will soon. That would be interesting to see.
And we would like to thank our sponsor, Gracious Day Grains. Sean, you like to eat healthy, don't you?
Always, buddy. I try to eat healthy as much as I can.
Yeah, and there is nothing healthier than what they call like farm to table, right? So when you can get something right from the ground and make it and then put it right on your table. And Gracious Day Grains, they have a tremendous selection, and it's totally organic. Everything is, they don't use any sort of herbicides or pesticides or anything like that. They have a bunch of different products on their website, Gracious Day Grains. So if you go to graciousdaymilling.com, you'll find a bunch of great stuff there, Sean.
Yeah, you will, Billy. And it's owned by Tom Maxey, who's a great guy from Virginia. He's a truth seeker, just like me and you, buddy. And Tom's growing philosophy follows the wisdom of farmers of centuries past. And a quote from Tom is, "If we practice the right rotations, we exclude the bugs and weeds without needing herbicides or pesticides." So, I mean, this is great, Billy. I mean, what he's doing is fantastic.
There's cornbread mix, there's cornmeal, popcorn he sells, buckwheat Sean, have you had buckwheat pancakes?
No, buddy.
Oh my, they're delicious. I love buckwheat pancakes. And Gracious Day Grains sells buckwheat pancakes. Just go to their website and you'll be able to find all of this stuff there. You can order it right off the website. You can find out all about how they farm and their whole philosophy, Tom's philosophy. It's great stuff.
It really is, Billy. And one of the things he does is he grinds small batches at very low temperatures, which retains the flavor and the freshness.
Of course. And it can't get any fresher than that. I mean, it's literally right from the ground. So again, go to graciousdaymilling.com and just, take a look on there. You can order whatever you want and they'll send it right to your door. Again, it doesn't get any fresher than that, right from Tom's farm to your door to your table. So
absolutely. And eat healthy and you'll feel better.
Absolutely. I wish I could do that. I wish I could eat healthier, Sean.
We'll start with Tom's stuff, buddy.
I'm going to order some of those buckwheat pancakes. I love
There you go. I'm going to try them too, Billy.
Yeah, they're really good. All right. Gracious Day. We thank Gracious Day Grains for their sponsorship.
Thank you.
Bill, go ahead, buddy.
Let me ask you a question. Again, kind of getting back to Trump and his game plan for what he's done, with the whole fake news. Really, over the years, we've seen countless lies from the media, right? Things that basically, we know the media is bought and paid for. There's not a whole lot you can trust with mainstream media right now, and it's been that way for many years. And what Trump has done is said, you can't trust what you hear. It's fake news. I'm the only person you can trust. I'm the only one who's going to tell you the truth. And a ridiculous amount of people believe that. Mm. And, nothing comes out of his mouth but lies. And we know that. But what if you were advising a Democratic candidate, how do you combat that, Joe? How do you combat what he's doing? What he essentially, he's taken the Hitler line where, the media is the enemy of the people. And he's used it now to win the presidency twice. How do you run against that? I think this was the biggest problem the Democrats have. They just don't know how to run against someone who just spouts constant lies, the way that he does.
Well, one good thing that's happened to the media is that they are now willing to say Trump is lying about this and he's lying about that. I must say the Washington Post and New York Times in some ways have covered the Trump administration pretty well so far by calling him out on these lies. It doesn't seem to have a great effect on his cult, because as people often say, the cult are, hard to penetrate. On the other hand, somebody made a good point yesterday about Tim Walz went around and said that 77 million people who voted for Trump, we might as well forget trying to reach them. They can't be reached. That's not true. And that's condescending and kind of self-defeating for the Democrats, because we can see vivid evidence of Trump supporters shouting down their Congress people at town halls. And there was an interview with the lady that they had on CNN where she was a Trump voter and she got fired from her low-level job with the Justice Department. She said they told her she had poor performance, and she said 3 weeks earlier she had been given a high job approval review. Right. So she said, I now regret that, I was fooled by Trump. Well, a lot of people are saying, well, screw these people. I don't have sympathy for them. But, these are people you can convert to voting for Democrats. And Tuesday, the 1st, we're going to have 3 important elections to fill House seats in Florida and the Supreme Court seat in Wisconsin.
Yep.
And there are signs, like in Florida, the seat that Michael Waltz held, he won by 30 points. It's now in play. That a poll shows the Democrat is like very close to the Republican, which is extraordinary. I think there's a lot of anger that will hit them. So, I mean, that's something the Democrats should be out there talking about. Somebody had a suggestion. The Democrats should have a regularly scheduled TV press conference every day at 5 o'clock, which is like 8 o'clock in the East. Well, actually, maybe 5 o'clock in these. Anyway, I'm in California, so I see time differently. But if they had a regular press conference and just every day commenting on the lies and making some really important points, and Bernie Sanders and Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez have been going around giving rallies, and they're getting huge reactions, and they're both truth tellers, great speakers, people.
And also, and labeled as extremists.
Yeah, but screw that. I mean,
right?
I think Democrats should not worry about these character attacks, because it goes with the territory. It really is reminiscent of the McCarthy era, and I'm old enough that I kind of remember that. And also the early Bush years, when lies were coming out every single day and they were doing outrageous things, and it catches up with people eventually. The hubris. I mean, Trump. Today it came out Trump wants a third term. He told Meet the Press that he's serious about considering a third term, which is completely unconstitutional. And he says he has methods of planning it. But it is difficult to counteract this barrage of lies. One thing they've done is flood the zone with many things at once, and it's really hard. You can't fight everything equally. And there's some really awful things that deserve strong condemnation, like the deportation of students and other people being hauled off the streets. That video of the woman, the Tufts student being kidnapped. Some neighbor happened to shoot from the window and got this powerful video. And the horrifying video of people down in El Salvador taken to this terrifying prison down there. And some things are more important than others to talk about. Like in this whole argument about the signal chat, obviously it's terrible that they didn't care about security, but 53 people, according to the Houthis anyway, were killed in this operation, including 5 children. And part of the transcript that was released, it says the subject that they're trying to kill with a drone, or I'm not sure it was a drone or an airplane, went into a building where his girlfriend lives, and then they said, "Oh, we just destroyed the building." So they killed at least this girlfriend, who was probably a civilian, and other people too. And people are not focusing on that. Why are we bombing them? And let's have a debate about that. People tend to shy away. That's one problem with Democrats, is they're too much part of the system to argue about things like, should we be bombing and killing people in all kinds of countries? We have bases all over the world. And there wasn't a peep from, well, there were peeps from Democrats when Obama killed 10,000 people with drones, but I kept talking about it, but a lot of Democrats just didn't bring it up. It's okay when Democrats do it, but it's not okay when Republicans do it.
Joe, let me ask you this. So what all we know now about JFK, I mean, it's unbelievable some of the things he was doing and trying to do. And when I look at Trump, he's a total opposite of JFK. I mean, everything JFK did for civil rights, and Trump is destroying DEI. I mean, he's taken down credentials of everybody in the military and stuff that except unless they're white. I mean, it's just unbelievable. And the things that JFK was doing for the environment and just consumers, and I could go on. And Trump is the exact opposite. So why do you think you were mentioning the cult before? But I noticed there's a lot of people inside the JFK, the research community even, and people that even listeners to our show, that are JFK lovers and JFK supporters. Why do you think there's so many that support Trump as well? Because when I see those two men, I can't think of two people that are more opposite than those two.
Yeah, I am surprised at certain people when, I go on assassination forums and then you find out that somebody who's sensible on the assassination is a Trump follower. It's kind of incongruous. I think it's partly this thing that I analyze in Political Truth, that there's a kind of a anti-authority trend, that, when you study, as I said, that when Kennedy was killed and I realized they weren't going to solve his crime, I lost a lot of my respect for the system, the political system, and I didn't want to be part of it. I didn't want to run for public life. I wanted to be a critic of the establishment, and then the Vietnam War came along. But the anti-authoritarianism is a healthy thing, but when you have an authoritarian regime running the country, and then you have people who are JFK researchers supporting Trump, it doesn't connect. I remember there was an article, Ron Rosenbaum, who's a good journalist, wrote a piece on JFK researchers that was somewhat mocking, but it was interesting. And he interviewed Penn Jones and his wife, Elaine. And Penn Jones was a hero of mine. He was a mentor of mine. He was the small town newspaper guy from Waxahachie, Texas, who was out there researching the assassination and breaking all kinds of stories, and a fearless guy. And he said, I didn't realize it was a conspiracy until Sunday. That's how naive I was, he said. But he was a great reporter. And Elaine Jones made the point. She said, I don't think a lot of these researchers really didn't love JFK, and I don't see how you can get into this if you didn't love JFK. And she said, I asked David Lifton, did you love JFK? And she said he wouldn't answer the question. And I think you can research the case if let's say you didn't particularly admire JFK, or you had a lot of doubts about him. He wasn't perfect, obviously, as a politician. I don't care much about the personal life. I'm talking about the political life. There are things you can question, but you could still care about the miscarriage of justice in the assassination if you're not a Kennedy fan. And I was a supporter, but I try to be, dispassionate and careful when I write about him. I don't see my role as being a fan, but if you're totally against what he stood for on civil rights and other things, social welfare programs, etc., he wasn't super great on civil rights for a long time. It took him a while to come around to that. But by 1963, he was strong on civil rights. He evolved. But, with Trump, they're taking down tributes and websites, say on Arlington Cemetery's website, indiscriminately taking down tributes to Black and Native American and female heroes, the Code Talkers, the Navajos, and Jackie Robinson and Colin Powell, and, all kinds of people who were Tuskegee Airmen. I mean, what is this? It's crazy stuff. Their agenda is quite clear. It's racist, and that really goes against what the Kennedys stood for. So I do think it's peculiar, but I think it is a sign of sort of indiscriminate anti-government tendencies, And Reagan was the guy who kind of caught that wave. And I'm reading more about, the Goldwater years and the Reagan years, and Goldwater kind of led the way, but he was perceived as too extreme. But actually, when you look at the 1964 election, he was telling the truth about a lot of things. And Johnson was lying like crazy to the public, saying we wouldn't get a war in Vietnam. And the minute he got in, he expanded the war big time. And Goldwater, his record on civil rights was not good. But he was, in some ways, an honorable politician. He and JFK were friends. They were going to travel around the country in 1964 together and kind of have Lincoln Douglas type debates. At least they showed that you could be bipartisan and friendly to the opposition without demonizing the opposition. But Reagan came along and made the government the enemy very explicitly,
right.
And that captured the imagination of a lot of people. And he had that charisma and charm that fooled people into thinking he was this, lovable guy. But he did a lot to reverse the New Deal programs of FDR, going back further than JFK. But look at Nixon. He for all the bad things he did, expanding the Vietnam War and bombing Cambodia, et cetera. He created the Environmental Protection Agency and various things. He wanted to have a national health program, and ironically, Teddy Kennedy torpedoed it because he didn't think it was good enough, and it took many years until Obama got that through. So Reagan did a lot of damage to our country and to our economy. We're still paying the price. I remember when Reagan got in, our national debt was $2 trillion, and he doubled it in, I don't know if it was the first 4 years of the first 8, and we thought that was shocking that it went up to 4 trillion, and now it's wildly escalated, and they don't care. And I read that 20% of our budget goes to servicing the debt, and one thing that people didn't focus on, how did Bush pay for the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, which were illegal? He didn't want to raise taxes, just like Johnson didn't raise taxes for a while to fund the Vietnam War, because that would be divisive. Bush borrowed money from Asia, and China and South Korea and Japan, they were really happy to support it. I mean, partly South Korea and Japan are our allies, but China's not our ally. And they were happy to get America deeply involved in these quagmires over there. And what an irresponsible way to have wars, because, we haven't declared a war since 1941. People kind of forget this is, I've talked to lawyers, I have a friend who's a conservative lawyer, and I said, the Constitution says Congress has the right to declare war, and not the president unilaterally going to war. And he sort of brushed it aside like, haha, who cares? But it's no coincidence the last war we actually won was the last war we declared in 1941. We won with the help of our allies, because you need the support of the public if you're going to war. But if you have wars that are concocted by a president, they backfire. They tend to backfire. And the Korean War was considered a stalemate. And Eisenhower, to his credit, ran on ending the Korean War, and he actually did. But I remember Chesty Puller, who was a Marine hero. He got his 5th Navy Cross in Korea. John Ford made a movie about him. And when people would say it was a stalemate in Korea, he'd say, stalemate, hell, we lost. We got the shit kicked out of us by the commies, And he was telling the truth, that was another loss. And then we lost the war in Vietnam. People said that was the first war we lost, but that's not really true.
Right.
So I just want to go back to civil rights again. I think, if we look at a lot of the information that's come out now, I think, Kennedy, we have to look at Kennedy as he understood that a lot of the Southern conservatives in the Democratic Party were not going to pass anything on civil rights. So I think he did a lot of things, through the court system, through executive orders. And I don't really think he was slow to come around. I think he just understood that it was going to be hard to get anything through official channels like that, through bills. But if you look at like what him and Bobby did in Prince Edward County, building a whole school district really so young Black kids could have a place to go to school. And even Jim Diogenio talks about, the day he was inaugurated, that, he looked around and he saw the Coast Guard parade, and there was no Black people in it. And he called in, I think he called in Dylan, and he said, what's going on here? Why is there no Black faces out there? And he said, I don't know. And he said, well, find out. So I think Kennedy was I don't think he was slow on civil rights. I think that was another thing with the media. The media does a lot of character assassination to Kennedy. They really gaslighted a lot of the stuff on, his personal life and everything. And you see that with the right-wing media too, where they just gaslighted the Democrats. And I think that led to a lot of people that voted Democrat switching to Republican and switching to MAGA. Because I think it started with Rush Limbaugh. And then you look today, you have Joe Rogan, you have these other hardcore right-wingers, and Joe Rogan actually didn't start out as a right-winger. He kind of, sold out and turned. But they just, and Fox News just constantly gaslights. Like Fox News take on the whole emails thing with releasing the war plans was that, you know, America should be proud of Trump's leadership. That was their take on that. I mean, that's just, it's bizarre. And just imagine listening to that all day, and, you know, you just get, they just gaslight it, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I go into what they call the siloing of news, that people, you know, we used to say, wouldn't it be wonderful when we have cable TV, we'll have 500 channels and we'll get all kinds of points of view. And it's pretty pathetic. It's gotten worse. I mean, there's not much to watch on TV, but
Right.
the people who are super right wingers, they get everything from Fox, and 80% of that is false. That's some study showed that it's probably worse now.
Probably
But
worse.
the liberals get their news from Rachel Maddow, who's bad in her own way.
She's bad on the JFK case.
Yeah, she's just terrible, demonizing conspiracy theories, and that's how she keeps her job, I guess. NBC has this official policy, according to Alec Baldwin, of supporting the Warren report, you know, and they have to.
Yep.
I mean, that's true of the mainstream media in general, but you know, CNN is pretty good in some ways. But what I tell students when I taught media study, you have to be a critic of the media and get your news from all kinds of sources. You know, I read about 10 sources every day, and you know, I don't take any at face value, and I critique them and compare the news. And there's a great quote from Gore Vidal, who I knew, who said that when he talked to some of his Russian friends back in the days of the USSR, that they were very well informed. And he said, how do you guys know all this stuff? Because you just read Pravda, right? I mean, and they would smile and say, you have to know how to read Pravda. In other words, to read between the lines. And he said that about the New York Times. You have to know how to read the New York Times. And that's reading between the lines is important, what they leave out and how they shade the wording, and you know, compare it to what the Washington Post reports, and also all kinds of smaller media outlets, you know, websites and bloggers, etc., who do really good work reporting on things the mainstream media won't report. Yeah, with JFK, I mean, I do think he was slow to kind of become supportive. Roosevelt was similar, because, you know, Roosevelt never supported an anti-lynching bill because he needed the Southern votes. The Southern votes were Democrats, and it seems shameful now that, you know, I tell my students, when did they finally passed an anti-lynching bill? It was last year. Biden got an anti-lynching bill passed. It was called the Emmett Till anti-lynching bill, 2024. You know, and there were many lynchings back in the 30s that Roosevelt kind of looked the other way at, and but he needed the Southern Democrats and others to pass his New Deal programs, and that was his decision. And but he had a certain amount of racism. I mean, he was the guy who authorized the Japanese internment, Japanese American in World War II, Japanese Americans. And I read a whole book about what was Roosevelt's role in that. And basically, this researcher had studied the record exhaustively, and he concluded that Roosevelt didn't really think about it very much. He just signed the thing. He just kind of thought, okay, the Army wants to do this, and he didn't give it a moment's thought. And he and
John
Eleanor,
McCoy was heavily involved in that.
yeah, and Earl Warren as governor of California, or was he attorney general at the time? I think he was attorney general. But, you know, Eleanor and Franklin Roosevelt were anti-Semitic to some extent too. And our record on the Holocaust was horrifyingly shameful. They didn't do much to stop the Holocaust. McCoy was partly involved. At the Holocaust Museum, you can see a letter on the wall from McCoy that some Jewish leaders wanted us to bomb the rail lines leading into Auschwitz and bomb the crematoria. And we were bombing a ball bearing plant right nearby, but we couldn't. They said we can't spare the bombers to do these other tasks. And so by the time, and Roosevelt's position was, well, you know, the best thing we can do for the Jews is win the war. But by that point, 6 million of them were dead, and 4 million other people died in the camps. And but Kennedy grew up in Boston, and he admitted really he didn't know Black people personally much, you know, and it took him a while to kind of become
He was elitist.
comfortable, friendly.
Family.
Yeah, but he started listening to Black leaders. Jackie Robinson, for example, it's interesting. He was supporting Nixon. My dad was a reporter in the Milwaukee Journal, and he told me once he covered an event in our hometown where Jackie Robinson came and spoke for Nixon at a Republican gathering. And Nixon had a fairly sympathetic view of civil rights, relatively, and he changed as president. They became racist with their Southern strategy. But they were dubious about JFK's record, a lot of Black leaders. But Johnson, as Robert Caro writes about in his third volume, he got this limited civil rights bill passed Congress because it was his only way of being taken seriously as a presidential aspirant. But they started making limited progress in civil rights. But Kennedy still, as you say, he needed people like Richard Russell and these other segregationists, Fulbright. He wanted Fulbright as his Secretary of State, and he would have been good, except he was a segregationist, and they didn't think they could get away with appointing him. But Kennedy started supporting the civil rights marchers and protesters, and as you said, the Justice Department did a lot. Robert Kennedy was really galvanized to support them. There's a good
He was
book.
working hard on that bill after too, the Johnson passed.
Yeah, and
that's the only reason he stayed on.
Yeah, he did great stuff. I recommend that movie Crisis, another terrific documentary on the Kennedys. It's about the efforts to get Black students into the University of Alabama over the opposition of George Wallace, and it intercuts between RFK and JFK in Washington manipulating the situation and the people on the ground, and it's very dramatic and really inspiring.
Really?
I interviewed Ricky Leacock, who was a great documentarian. He was one of the cameramen in that film, and he and I showed that in primary at an event, and I said to him, when you see Crisis, you feel this feeling. I don't feel much that I'm proud of our government when I see this film. We went to bat for these two Black students, got them into Kennedy, mobilized the National Guard, and but Leacock wouldn't agree with me. He was an old lefty, and I said, aren't you proud of what they did? But JFK and RFK and Nicholas Katzenbach, who doesn't have a good record on the assassination, but he was the point man they sent there to confront Wallace. But it was all kind of kabuki theater, too. You have to sort of understand that they had sort of worked out a plan to let Wallace save face by standing in the door of the schoolroom door, as they called it, and confronting the government, and then stepping aside and letting the Black students enter, But so the Kennedys got really involved. They couldn't stay away from it. I remember vividly, this was the big national issue in the 60s, and I was very stirred by that issue as more than any other issue. And then when you had Medgar Evers getting shot, John F. Kennedy gave that great speech on civil rights, and Evers was shot when he arrived home right after that speech. Terrible stuff was happening. And so JFK, he's revered by Black Americans for good reason, and his brother and Bobby grew a lot. Arthur Schlesinger's biography of Robert Kennedy is really inspiring. Some of this stuff is inspiring. But Robert Kennedy was kind of a narrow-minded guy, and he grew over time. And once his brother was shot, he became a champion of underprivileged people, poor people, and people of color.
They were young guys too. People don't understand that.
Right.
In his mid-30s and out in his early 40s. Then you got to understand the Democratic Party. I think it's hard for people to understand today. You just think of right wing, you think Republican, left wing, Democrat, but the Southern Democrats, they were all more towards the right, especially on civil rights, and a lot of those would turn Republican later. We talked about that.
Right.
Yeah, and one thing I go into in Political Truth is really interesting, and Into the Nightmare too, my other book on the assassination. Richard Russell, and people can hear these phone calls online, they're astonishing. Richard Russell, longtime senator from Alabama, and he'd been the governor. He was, I'm sorry, Georgia, not Alabama. I was thinking of Wallace. Russell was really knowledgeable on foreign affairs. He was a segregationist, but on foreign affairs, he really knew his stuff. And Johnson treated him as a mentor. He and Sam Rayburn were Johnson's mentors, older men that he kind of sucked up to, rise to power. But Russell was a wise man who Johnson would listen to. And they're having these discussions on Vietnam in the spring of '64. And Russell is saying, Johnson is saying, I don't know what to do this, I mean, like they're pushing me to get into this war and big time. And I know that it's not going to go well. And it's tearing me apart. And he hadn't even sent the bulk of troops over yet. It happened in '65. So Russell was saying, it's a hell of a mess and I wouldn't get into it. He said, if you have a war in Vietnam, it'll last 10 years and we'll lose 50,000 Americans. That's just about exactly what happened.
Yeah.
Right.
He didn't mention 3 million, 4 million Asians, but he
Right.
said it would be a disaster and stay out of it. And Johnson said, I just don't know what to do. And, when you hear this stuff, it is inescapable if you have an open mind that Johnson didn't want to have a big war in Vietnam, but he felt compelled to do it. Now, why did he feel compelled? That was the price he paid to become president.
Yeah.
That his supporters, and I go into this a lot in Into the Nightmare, the far right people in Texas and elsewhere were part of the military-industrial complex, and they were very big suppliers. I mean, Johnson was owned and operated by Halliburton. And, when Kennedy was dying, an extraordinary thing, right at the moment when Kennedy was declared dead at 1 o'clock, Johnson was in a cubicle nearby and he was on the phone to his tax lawyer in Dallas, Waddy Bullion, great name. And he said, oh, does this mean I got to sell my goddamn Halliburton stock? I mean, can you imagine? And Halliburton, had taken over Brown and Root, which owned and operated Johnson's from the '30s. If you read Caro's books, Johnson made this unholy pact with Brown and Root in the '30s to help them build a dam in Texas. It made them a huge amount of money, and he got bags of money from them over the years and distributed it throughout the country, and that's why he became a national power. But Brown and Root then sold out to Halliburton in '62. And Halliburton, I read a book on them, and they formed a consortium with, I think it was 3 other construction and oil companies, and they had something like 96% of the construction contracts in Vietnam. Can you imagine? Yeah. Including building Cam Ranh Bay, which was an artificial harbor the United States built. That was our main place where we'd send our big ships in. Yeah. And the consortium got like a $2 billion contract, something like that. And so this is Johnson. Johnson had stock in this, and Caro goes into how, when you're president, you're supposed to put your assets in a blind trust, and Johnson said he would do that, and he didn't. He actually had a hotline behind his desk in the Oval Office to the guy who ran his blind trust in Texas. And he was on the phone with him all day long, buying and selling stocks and stuff. And this was partly, I think, revealed by the Wall Street Journal. And Johnson got away with it, and he made millions and millions as president. Mm-hmm. But his obligation to these people was to have a big war in Vietnam. And the General Dynamics scandal, there were Fort Worth Company and Halliburton and other companies made a fortune in Vietnam. And Oliver Stone mentions that at the end of JFK, in addition to calling for the release of the records, he has statistics on how many airplanes we lost in Vietnam and how many airplane flights were taken and paid for by the American government to ferry people over to Vietnam. And at first I thought, wow, this is really unusual to see this in a film. This is great. And he names names of the companies involved too. And so Johnson, it was a tragic thing where he made this unholy deal and he realized he couldn't win the war. He knew the war would be a disaster, and it destroyed his Great Society program, the social welfare program. In 1970, when I met Orson Welles for the first time, and I've written 3 books on him, and Welles put me in a film and I acted for him, and we had a 3-hour talk, and I antagonized Welles because I criticized Johnson. And Wells was an old New Deal liberal. He was a friend of Roosevelt, and he campaigned for Roosevelt. And he thought Johnson was just a great president. And I guess it was because on civil rights and Medicare and other issues, he was terrific. But I said, the Vietnam War is a disaster. And this is 1970, it had been dragging on. Johnson was out of office by then, but I was covering student protests, which often became riots. The police would attack the students, and the students would smash things and blow things up. And I said, the students in Madison are getting really they're getting crazy. They're going to kill somebody real soon. And Johnson got really angry at me Wells got really angry at me for criticizing the anti-war students. How could you criticize them? And then I got back home. Was it 3 days later? I arrived at the airport 7:30 in the morning, and I asked the cab driver what happened over the weekend when I was gone. And he said, "Oh, the students just blew up a building. They blew up Sterling Hall, which was where the Army Math Research Center was planning bombing missions in Vietnam, and they killed a graduate student." And it helped end the anti-war movement. That was another tragic thing. That and the Greenwich Village townhouse explosion of the Weather Underground turned the liberal, nonviolent people against protest, and it kind of fed into Nixon's escalation of the war. And if you remember, I'm sure that when Nixon ran for president, he said, "I have a secret plan to end the war." And his secret plan was to pull out American troops to placate the public, but to expand the bombing exponentially. And the bombing just increased by huge amounts, and millions of people died because of this. And it was shocking.
Yeah. Well, Joe, we've kept you a long time. We really appreciate your being so generous with your time with us. And Sean, this is a discussion we've wanted to have with Joe for quite a while.
Yeah.
So we really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, and you guys are doing good work and keeping the focus on not only what's happening today, but why it's happening and why we've gotten into this mess. What happened to our country?
It's a mess.
Yeah.
We used to have a functioning democracy, and we don't anymore. And that's what I tried to trace in Political Truth, that things started unraveling when Kennedy was shot, and we didn't tell the truth. If you want to have a public support, you have to be credible and punish people who, you kill the president at high noon on public street and blow his brains out, and nobody's punished. But they punished one guy who didn't do it, and the public saw it through that. The public is smarter than people think, and they, as I mentioned, half the public seems kind of blinkered, and part of it is the decline of public education, where people don't know history. But anyway, but when we study the history and connect what happened to Kennedy and the other leaders in the 60s who were killed with what's happening today, it starts to be clearer. If you read Peter Dale Scott's books, he does a lot of good connecting of all these events. And so there's a continuum that we've run into, and it's where we go from here is hard to know, but it doesn't look good at the moment.
No, it does not.
At all.
All right, Joe. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We appreciate you staying with us.
Thank you, fellas. See you next time.
Thank you. That's Enough Out of You podcast is executive produced and written by Bill Rader and Sean Kane, and edited by Bill Rader. The That's Enough Out of You podcast and logo are exclusive property of Bags of Chicken, LLC. Any rebroadcast, retransmission, or accounts of this podcast without the express written consent of Bags of Chicken, LLC is prohibited. So don't even try it.